The command deck of Fortress Halcyon was never silent, but tonight, an unnatural tension pressed against the steel walls. Commander Jackson Voss stood at the helm, staring at the transmission screen, his jaw tightening. The air carried the faint tang of metal and recycled oxygen, a product of decades-old ventilation systems. Dim emergency lights bathed the room in an eerie glow, a precaution during high alert status. Outside, Dartis IV raged. The planet below was a churning storm world, its surface a chaotic dance of lightning tearing through poisonous clouds. The sight had always unsettled new recruits, but Jackson found it oddly familiar. It mirrored the unease tightening his gut. Then came the alert, a classified priority transmission. The screen flickered, displaying a heavily encrypted data stream. A moment later, an automated voice cut through the air. Commander Voss, immediate secure link requested. Priority, critical. Jackson exhaled, straightening his uniform as he glanced at his second-in-command, Lieutenant Doran Hale. The man had served under him for years, sharp-eyed and steady, though even he looked wary now. Patch it through, Jackson ordered. The image sharpened, revealing a figure draped in assembly insignia, High Chancellor Virak. The reptilian leader's rigid posture betrayed what his kind rarely showed: fear. Commander Voss, Virak's tone was clipped. We require Earth's intervention. Jackson's brow furrowed. The Galactic Assembly had spent years dismissing humanity as a dangerous anomaly, a species that thrived where others perished. Now they were asking for help? Intervention? Jackson echoed, his voice calm but edged. For what exactly? The Chancellor hesitated. That was answer enough. Jackson leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Start talking. A static-laced pause, then the truth dropped like a hammer. Entire civilizations are disappearing, Virak admitted. No distress calls, no survivors. The deck fell still. Even the background chatter of the bridge crew quieted. Jackson exchanged a glance with Hale, who folded his arms, expression unreadable. Who's responsible? Jackson asked. Another pause. We don't know. Jackson's fingers curled against the console. No survivors, no distress calls. That meant whoever, whatever was behind this, was methodical, fast, and absolute. Virak's gaze sharpened. You are the only ones equipped to handle this. We need Earth's military intelligence. We need your war fleets. Jackson studied the Chancellor. This wasn't a diplomatic plea. It was desperation. The Assembly had mocked Earth for years, labeling them a primitive death world. And now, when the galaxy's finest had vanished without a trace, they came crawling to the very people they had ridiculed. Send me everything you have, Jackson said finally. Every sensor log, every intercepted transmission. If we're stepping into this, we're not walking in blind. Virak didn't argue. The feed cut, and the data began pouring in. Jackson turned to Hale. Get the intelligence teams on this. I want every detail analyzed. Hale gave a sharp nod. And if the Assembly's hiding something? Jackson's expression darkened. Then we find out the hard way. Outside, lightning cracked across Dartis IV, its storming heart a reflection of the war yet to come. Data streamed across the command center's display, lines of encrypted code unraveling into fragmented reports. Jackson scanned the incoming files, his fingers tightening against the metal railing. The decrypted logs painted a picture no strategist wanted to see. Entire fleets erased, planetary defenses overwhelmed in minutes, and terrain so twisted by unknown forces that reconnaissance teams failed to return. Hale stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes flicking between the screens. The low glow of tactical displays cast sharp shadows on his face. They're not just wiping civilizations out, he muttered. They're altering the battlefields themselves. Jackson barely heard him. A recording played, grainy footage from Varon 7's outer sensor grid. At first it showed only stars, then movement. A fleet emerged from the void, its ships unlike anything recorded. No sleek lines, no visible thrusters, just jagged, unnatural masses shifting as though alive. Then the signal fractured. 1 second, the colony still stood, its lights flickering across the surface. The next, the feed was static and silence. Jackson exhaled through his nose. No warning, No time to respond. They didn't just attack, they erased it. Hale's voice came quieter now. Sir, if they hit an assembly world like that, what chance does anyone else have? Jackson straightened. We're not anyone else. Get the War Council assembled. If the Assembly expects us to fight their war, they're going to do it on our terms. Hale nodded and relayed the order. Within minutes, key officers materialized around the central display. The scent of heated metal and static filled the air as tactical grids adjusted, pulling up maps of affected sectors. Fleet Marshal Darius Kane's voice cut through the room. What are we dealing with? Jackson tapped the controls. Unknown fleet composition, unknown origin. Attacks show extreme precision. Civilian evacuations failed because they had no time. Whatever they're using, it manipulates the environment. No survivors, no wreckage. Kane's eyes narrowed. Terraforming? Jackson glanced at the final logs. More than that. These planets weren't just destroyed. They were transformed into something uninhabitable. One of the officers, Major Ryland Voss, studied the readings. Gravity fluctuations, atmospheric shifts, toxic compounds introduced within minutes. That's not war, it's forced extinction. Kane folded his hands. And they think we're the ones who can stop it? Jackson's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Not think. No. Because whatever they're using to kill other species, we evolved in worse. Silence held for a moment. The unspoken truth hung between them. Earth's reputation as a death world had been a badge of shame to the Assembly, until now. Kane's voice was measured. Then we give them a reason to fear what we're capable of. Jackson nodded. We won't wait for them to come to us. We strike first. The Assembly gave us clearance to deploy. We take the fight to the last known battlefield and see what's left. Kane's eyes sharpened. And when we find them? Jackson's fingers tapped against the display. We teach them that Earth doesn't fall quietly. The warship Indomitable cut through the void, its reinforced hull absorbing the shifting pressures of faster-than-light travel. Jackson stood near the primary viewport, his gaze locked on the distant glow of Varon 7's ruined orbit. The planet loomed ahead, an open wound in space, its once thriving colonies reduced to a scarred wasteland of unnatural storms and shifting land masses. The tactical crew worked in silence, their movements precise as they processed the final approach. The ship's gravitational stabilizers adjusted, keeping the deck steady beneath Jackson's boots. A distant vibration trembled through the hull, not from engines, but the ship adjusting to the anomaly ahead. Even through reinforced plating, something about this world felt wrong. Hale stepped beside him, eyes flicking over the readings. Sensors are failing to get a clear planetary scan. Gravity is fluctuating in patterns we've never seen before. Jackson exhaled, watching the distortion ripple across the display. Like a living thing deciding what it wants to be. Kane's voice came through the intercom. Landing teams, final prep. We need answers, not theories. The ship's descent began. Outside, Varon 7's atmosphere churned like a sea in a storm, thick clouds curling into impossible shapes. Electrical currents slashed across the sky, but the colors were wrong. Violent indigos, pulsing silvers, and streaks of dark red like exposed veins in a fractured sky. Jackson gripped the rail as the ship's landing thrusters engaged, sending up a billowing storm of displaced dust and debris. As soon as the hatch hissed open, heat clawed at his skin, thick and unnatural. The air tasted metallic, sharp against the tongue, as if it had been forged rather than formed. Hale activated his suit's internal filtration. Whatever did this, it's still changing the planet. This isn't just an abandoned battlefield. Jackson's boots pressed into the dirt, but the ground didn't feel solid. It shifted, flexing underfoot like something alive adjusting to an unfamiliar weight. He motioned for the squad to spread out, weapons at the ready. If anything remained here, it wouldn't be friendly. The first structure came into view, a collapsed defense station, its walls eaten away by something corrosive. Steel had melted into jagged tendrils, the metal no longer obeying its natural shape. Kane ran his gauntlet over a twisted support beam, then withdrew quickly. The alloy wasn't just warped. It pulsed, faintly shifting as if breathing. This wasn't a siege, Kane muttered. This was something else. A static burst crackled through comms. One of the scouts had gone silent. Jackson turned sharply. "Squad 3, report." Nothing. Then a sound, low, resonant, not mechanical, not organic, but something in between. It came from the ridge ahead, where the dust swirled unnaturally. The team tensed, rifles tracking movement. A figure emerged, its outline distorted, like a shadow peeling itself from the air. Hale's breath caught. "That's not one of ours." Jackson raised his weapon. "Number, and it's not alone." The figure moved with an unsettling fluidity, its outline shifting like heat warping metal. No light reflected off it. No solid features defined it. Only a silhouette folding in and out of itself, as though the air itself rejected its existence. Jackson felt an instinctual tension coil in his gut. This thing wasn't just foreign. It didn't belong. The squad reacted in practiced formation, boots pressing against the unstable earth that flexed like stretched hide beneath their weight. Rifles locked into position, fingers tightening against triggers. Kane's voice came low, steady. "Commander?" Jackson didn't answer. The distortion lengthened, a second shape bleeding into reality beside the first, then a third. No sound accompanied their emergence. No breathing, no shifting armor, no familiar rhythm of movement. Even the planet seemed to hold its breath. Hale took a slow step forward, testing their reaction. The figures twisted in place but did not charge. Instead, the ground beneath them rippled outward, a silent pulse spreading from where they stood. The dust spiraled in jagged patterns, twisting like frozen waves mid-collapse. Jackson's grip on his rifle tightened. "They're testing us." Kane's jaw clenched. "Or marking us." Then, the silence shattered. The first figure lunged without warning, closing the distance with impossible speed. Jackson barely had time to fire. The impact of the shot didn't break flesh. It shattered something else. The figure fractured on impact, dispersing into the air like smoke caught in reverse, reforming a second later, still advancing. "Fire at will," Jackson ordered. The air erupted in a storm of kinetic rounds, but the enemy didn't fall like ordinary soldiers. They absorbed the damage, reforming mid-collapse, advancing with an eerie lack of hesitation, as if the laws of physics had never applied to them. The first one reached Hale. His armor's shock plating flared as something clawed across it. Not metal, not bone, something sharper, hungrier. He staggered back, but the thing followed, pressing forward as if drawn to his breath. Jackson lunged, shoulder slamming the entity off course, and felt a piercing cold seep through his armor like sinking into frozen water. The thing didn't resist him like a body should. It bent, twisted, let itself be forced away as though it only needed to reform a moment later. "Fall back," Jackson barked. "Regroup at the ridge." The squad moved as one, boots kicking up the shifting terrain, but the ground didn't hold still. It convulsed beneath them, reacting to their movement. The figures pursued, no longer silent, now emitting a sound just beneath hearing, a pressure against the skull that made the world tilt at the edges. Jackson reached the ridge first, turning to cover the retreat. Hale barely cleared the incline when the first of the creatures stretched toward them, elongating unnaturally. "Commander!" Kane's voice cut through. "Our weapons won't hold them." Jackson's gaze flicked to the sky, where Indomitable loomed above, awaiting orders. His jaw set. "Then we change the battlefield." Jackson's pulse pounded against his skull as he activated his comms. "Indomitable, we need orbital strike coverage. Marking coordinates now." His fingers moved swiftly over his gauntlet, relaying their location to the command deck above. The figures below did not retreat, did not flinch, did not fear. They flowed across the terrain, reshaping themselves like liquid shadows, as if responding not to the physical world, but to some unseen force dictating their form. Hale braced against a jagged outcrop, breath tight. "Commander, if they're adapting this fast, how do we outmaneuver them?" Jackson narrowed his eyes, tracking the shifting landscape. "We give them something new to adapt to." A sharp blast of air pressure signaled the incoming orbital strike. From above, a flare of golden light carved through the upper atmosphere, streaking downward like a falling star. The ground quaked beneath them, as the first payload hit, a controlled kinetic detonation designed to displace rather than obliterate. The moment of impact rippled outward like a shockwave across water. The ground cracked, dust roiling in spirals as the terrain itself seemed to buckle. The creatures reacted instantly, snapping their attention skyward, twisting unnaturally as though tracking the descending force. But something was wrong. Instead of simply evading, the figures absorbed the blast, bodies warping around the energy as if devouring it. For a fraction of a second, their forms glowed from within, like embers stoked by unseen breath. Then, just as quickly, the light collapsed inward, vanishing. The battlefield went still. Too still. Jackson felt a chill, not from the air, but from the realization sinking into his gut. They're not just enduring the attack. They're learning from it. Kane's voice came sharp over comms. "Commander, they're shifting tactics, detecting movement behind us." Jackson turned fast. The terrain at their backs, once solid rock, now moved in slow undulations, like breathing stone. It wasn't the creatures adapting. It was the world itself. The squad tensed. Hale muttered under his breath, "This planet isn't dead. It's waking up." Jackson pressed a command into his gauntlet, marking an emergency fallback route. "All units, adjust formation. We're not in a firefight. We're in a test." The figures had stopped pursuing. They simply watched. Their forms no longer frantic, no longer lunging, just observing, as if calculating. Then one of them did something different. It lifted a hand, if it could be called that, and mirrored Jackson's stance. The meaning was unclear. A test, a warning, or worse, an invitation. Jackson's grip tightened on his rifle, though instinct told him a bullet wouldn't change what was unfolding here. The enemy wasn't just a fleet or a species or even a force of destruction. It was something else entirely. And for the first time, Jackson wasn't sure if they were fighting a war or standing at the edge of something far more dangerous. Jackson kept his rifle steady, but something deeper than instinct told him it wouldn't matter. The figure's raised hand, if it was even a hand, remained motionless, as if waiting. The others had ceased their movement entirely, frozen like specters suspended in the shifting air. The ridge beneath Jackson's boots no longer felt solid. The ground breathed, subtle but undeniable, like the slow rise and fall of a creature too vast to comprehend. It wasn't just the figures adapting. It was the entire planet. Kane's voice cut through the eerie silence. "Commander, orders?" Jackson didn't answer immediately. His mind worked through the pieces, a force that absorbed energy instead of breaking under it, terrain that reacted instead of remained, an enemy that watched instead of simply attacked. "We're leaving, now." Hale exhaled, muttering, "Finally something that makes sense." Jackson stepped back first, eyes never leaving the unmoving entities. The rest of the team mirrored him, shifting their formation into a slow retreat. Still, the figures did nothing. They merely observed, their edges flickering like shadows caught between two realities. The squad crested the ridge. The ship waited beyond the valley, gleaming against the fractured sky. Jackson activated his comms. "Indomitable, emergency retrieval, ETA." 5 minutes. The pilot's response was clipped. "Make it 3. Jackson turned to his men. "We move fast. No unnecessary fire. We don't engage unless provoked." The first few steps felt like walking away from something unfinished, but every instinct screamed that staying would be worse. Then the first shift came, not from the figures, but from the planet itself. The valley didn't tremble. It shifted, realigned, as if something beneath the surface had stirred awake. A deep fracture split through the terrain, stretching in either direction, cutting them off from their ship. Hale's voice edged toward panic. "That wasn't natural." Jackson didn't hesitate. "We find another route. Move." The team adjusted, shifting along the ridge, eyes darting between the collapsing terrain and the entities still standing motionless. Then, for the first time, the lead figure tilted its head. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But the meaning hit Jackson like a hammer. It knew. It understood what they were trying to do, and it was waiting to see what they'd do next. "Commander!" Kane pointed ahead. Beyond the fracture, the ship was no longer alone. Something new had arrived. A shadow against the upper atmosphere, descending without sound, without propulsion, without logic. A structure. No, a vessel, but not one built by hands. It moved like it had always been part of the sky, waiting for the right moment to step forward. Jackson felt the weight of the moment settle over his shoulders. They weren't leaving yet, and the thing in the sky had just decided to join the conversation. Jackson's breath tightened as he tracked the dark monolith descending from the upper atmosphere. It moved without acceleration, without any visible means of propulsion, as if the sky itself had decided to lower a new piece onto the battlefield. The sheer scale of it dwarfed anything built by human hands, a void against the swirling chaos of the corrupted planet. Hale adjusted his visor, scanning. "Commander, that thing is—" He stopped. "No readings, no mass, no gravity signature. It's just there." Jackson didn't need sensors to know what it meant. The figures below had paused, motionless, waiting. The shifting terrain had stalled, as if holding its breath. Something had changed. The monolith reached low orbit. A pulse rippled through the air, not sound, not light, but pressure, a presence that pressed against the skull. Jackson clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus. Kane's voice came sharp. "Orders?" Jackson turned, scanning the terrain for an exit. The fracture still separated them from the ship. The figures remained where they were, patient, unyielding. The monolith was lowering, but for what? Then the world cracked open, not with an explosion, not with force, but with something deeper, something that rewrote the air itself. A structure, long buried beneath shifting stone, began to rise. A spire of jagged, blackened alloy, unlike any material humans had ever recorded. It clawed out of the landscape like a thing coming up for air. Hale staggered back. That wasn't underground before. Jackson's rifle remained steady, but his pulse pounded like distant war drums. He was no scientist, but he knew battlefields, and this felt like one being built in real time. Kane's voice was a blade. "Commander, if this is an ambush," Jackson exhaled. "It's something worse." A new figure emerged, not from the ground, not from the air, but from between the spaces where the monolith's shadow met the terrain. It stepped forward in slow, deliberate motion, its form shifting, not like the others, but as if choosing its shape rather than reacting. Then it spoke, not in sound, not in words, but in pressure. The weight of it struck Jackson like standing at the edge of a great abyss, staring into something that wasn't supposed to be understood. His vision wavered, the edges of reality bending, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer presence of what stood before him. Then came the only clarity possible, a single message, not a warning, not a demand, but a statement. "You were not meant to see this." Jackson's fingers curled into a fist. Too late, they had seen, and whatever this was, it saw them back. Jackson forced a breath through his teeth, steadying the storm raging inside his chest. The weight of that message still pressed against him, not spoken, not heard, imprinted, as if something vast and unseen had reached into his mind and left its mark. Hale swallowed hard beside him, his hands tightening around his rifle. "Commander, tell me I imagined that." Jackson didn't answer. His focus remained locked on the figure before them, its form flickering between solid and intangible, like a mirage caught in the wrong dimension. The other entities still lingered in the valley below, unmoving, their attention drawn upward to the monolith's descent. A shape separated from its shadow, not a step, a shift, as though the figure was unraveling and reassembling itself between moments. Then the world changed again. The monolith halted, hovering just above the fractured spire that had erupted from beneath the planet's surface. A pulse of unseen force radiated outward, a ripple that bent light and sent a deep vibration into the bones. Jackson's vision darkened at the edges, balance wavering, but he forced his boots to stay planted. The terrain responded first. The fissures widened, stone peeling apart in smooth, unnatural layers. The ground wasn't breaking, it was shedding, revealing something beneath, something ancient. Kane's voice came through clenched teeth. "We're standing on top of something." Jackson's jaw tightened. Not something. A structure. The monolith pulsed again and the air shuddered. The very fabric of space seemed to warp around them. Then the figure before Jackson moved, not attacking, not advancing, but mirroring him again. It raised its hand in the same slow, deliberate motion. "Commander!" Hale's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's waiting." Jackson's pulse steadied. He had seen battlefields. He had seen last stands, ambushes, war-torn cities swallowed in fire. This was different. This wasn't a war. It was a test. He shifted his weight, lowering his rifle, not surrendering, but responding. The figure did the same. Then, for the first time, its shape stabilized. It held form, no flickering, no shifting between states. Kane's knuckles whitened. "Commander, whatever you're doing—" Jackson lifted his hand. Not a weapon, not a signal of force. A response, a silent answer to whatever had been asked. The figure reacted. The pulse of pressure that followed wasn't an attack. It was acknowledgement. And in that moment, Jackson knew they had just stepped across a threshold, one they couldn't return from, because whatever force had been waiting beneath this planet's surface had just recognized them in return. Jackson barely had a moment to process the shift before the air thickened, not in pressure, not in heat, but in presence. The world around him no longer felt like just a battlefield. It felt claimed. The monolith's hovering mass radiated something unseen, something that pressed against his skull like a half-formed thought trying to force its way through. The shifting figures below had stopped flickering, stabilizing into defined shapes, recognizing him. A deep tremor ran beneath his boots. Not an earthquake, not an impact, a breath. The planet wasn't just reacting anymore. It was awakening. Hale took a slow step back, his voice quiet but strained. "Commander, tell me you feel that." Jackson's fingers curled into a fist, grounding himself. "It's watching." Kane's voice came sharp. "Then we give it a reason to keep its distance." He lifted his rifle, but Jackson shot out a hand, stopping him. Number not yet. Kane's expression tightened, but he held position. The figures remained motionless, neither advancing nor retreating. The monolith above began to tilt ever so slightly, as if shifting its focus. Then the planet itself moved. Not crumbling, not shattering, but peeling away in seamless layers, revealing something buried deep beneath. The terrain wasn't natural. It had been constructed. A vast circular pattern emerged below, not ruins, not wreckage, machinery. Jackson exhaled. "We weren't the first ones here." Kane's jaw locked. "Then why didn't anyone survive?" No answer came. Only the sound of shifting stone, the deep resonance of something old and vast stirring beneath the surface. The figure before Jackson lowered its hand. Not in retreat, not in surrender. In completion. Jackson felt it before it happened. The moment they had stepped across the threshold, something had been decided. The monolith pulsed, and everything changed. The sky fractured. Not physically, not visibly, but Jackson felt the shift, like stepping from one reality into another without moving an inch. A second shape descended from the monolith, smaller, controlled, crafted with intention rather than mass. It did not fall, did not hover. It arrived. Jackson's throat tightened. "It's not attacking. It's delivering something." Hale swallowed. Delivering what? The structure touched the ground with a silence that felt unnatural, as if sound itself refused to acknowledge it. A seam split down the center, parting like the slow unfurling of something long sealed. Jackson adjusted his stance. His instincts screamed that whatever was inside was not meant for them, yet it had arrived anyway. Then, from the depths of the newly opened structure, something stepped out. Not shifting, not flickering. Solid. A shape with purpose, a presence with intent. And as Jackson met its gaze, he knew. This was not a discovery. This was a revelation. Jackson stood rooted to the shifting terrain as the figure emerged from the depths of the monolithic structure. It moved with deliberate precision, each step soundless, its form distinct from the flickering entities that had surrounded them before. This one wasn't testing them. It already understood them. The shape held an unmistakable presence, not like a soldier, not like a conqueror, but something else entirely. The surface of its body, if it could be called that, reflected no light, yet it was not void. It absorbed perception, as if its very existence bent the rules of sight. Kane's grip tightened on his rifle, but he didn't lift it. His voice was sharp but controlled. "Commander, this one's different." Jackson's breath came slow, steady. "Yeah, it knows we're here, knows we're watching." Hale shifted his stance, scanning. "The others reacted to us. This one expects something." The figure stopped a dozen paces away. It did not raise a weapon. It did not speak. It waited. Jackson measured the distance between them, feeling the weight of the encounter settle into his bones. Every instinct screamed that they had crossed a line that had remained untouched for longer than human history could fathom. The ground beneath them stabilized, as if the world had decided the test was over. The pulsing energy from the monolith softened, recalibrating. Then, for the first time, the figure moved with intention. It lifted a single hand, fingers, or something like them, unfurling. A gesture not of aggression, not of surrender, but of purpose. Jackson barely had time to react before the air shifted, dense and layered, pressing against his skull like a presence slipping past the physical. A voice, though not a voice. A message, though not words. "You are not the first, but you are the last." A chill settled into Jackson's spine. Kane took a slow step forward, jaw set. "What does that mean? Who are you?" The figure did not respond with sound. Instead, the monolith pulsed, and the ground beneath them trembled. Jackson clenched his fists. He had seen battlefields reduced to rubble, had stood in the ruins of civilizations that never saw war coming. But this was something else. Hale exhaled through his teeth. "They're not just remnants. They're custodians." Jackson's voice came low. "And we just stepped into their vault." The figure turned slightly, shifting its gaze, or whatever passed for one, toward the fractured terrain beyond them. The same unnatural pressure filled the air again, pressing against their thoughts, a transmission they weren't built to receive but could not ignore. The monolith pulsed once more, and suddenly the ruins beneath their feet came to life. Not broken, dormant. Jackson swallowed hard. They hadn't just found an abandoned world. They had awakened something buried beneath it. Jackson steadied himself as the ruins beneath them stirred, awakening piece by piece, a structure reassembling itself from time-worn stillness. The terrain no longer felt dead. It pulsed, like something ancient stretching after an eon of slumber. The figure before them remained motionless, an unmoving sentry, but the monolith behind it was shifting, not descending, not rising, but folding inward, collapsing into something denser. Hale exhaled sharply. "Commander, whatever's happening, it's not stopping." Jackson didn't answer. His focus was locked on the gaps forming within the ruins like a puzzle rearranging itself. The ground beneath his boots hadn't simply cracked. It had restructured. A design was revealing itself, and whatever force had buried it was no longer in control. Kane's voice remained clipped. "This isn't just a remnant. This is a mechanism." Jackson took a slow step forward, watching as a passage took shape ahead, a pathway that hadn't existed moments ago. The ruins weren't ruins. They were a door. The figure in front of them turned slightly, its form steady now, no longer flickering, no longer mirroring. It was leading. Jackson felt the weight of the decision settle over him. He had fought wars where the enemy was clear, where battle lines were drawn, where the only objective was survival. But this was something far more dangerous. The monolith pulsed again, and the ground rumbled, not violently but methodically, like an unseen hand shifting gears deep beneath the surface. Hale's voice was low, almost reverent. "This isn't just a structure. This whole planet is a construct." Jackson exhaled through his nose. "And we just turned it back on." The figure stepped aside, its motion deliberate. The path before them was clear, the ruins now glowing faintly along their edges, as if power was returning to systems long forgotten. Kane's grip tightened on his weapon. "Commander, this could be a trap." Jackson glanced at the figure, then at the shifting terrain, then back toward the distant ship waiting beyond the ridge. Something about this moment felt irreversible. He turned to his men. "We go in. We move as one. We document everything." Hale frowned. "And if it's a one-way trip?" Jackson flexed his fingers. "Then we make sure someone remembers we were here." The squad adjusted formation. As they took their first steps into the revealed passage, the air shifted again, denser, charged, filled with something unseen, pressing against their thoughts. The monolith above them dimmed, its purpose served. The shifting ground beneath them stilled. Jackson didn't look back. Whatever lay ahead had been waiting long before they arrived, and now it had them exactly where it wanted. The corridor ahead stretched into shadow, lined with walls that weren't just metal, weren't just stone. The surface pulsed faintly beneath the squad's boots, not alive but not inert, a construct that responded to their presence. The air carried a weight, thick with something beyond atmosphere, something pressing against thought rather than breath. Jackson advanced first, rifle angled low but ready. The space wasn't silent. Faint sounds, not mechanical, not organic, whispered through the passage, distant but deliberate. Kane moved beside him, eyes sharp, tension in his shoulders. Hale glanced at the dim veins of light running through the walls. "Whatever powered this place isn't gone. It's waiting." Jackson nodded. That was the problem. The passage ahead descended in spiraling patterns, twisting in ways that made distances impossible to judge. The walls were too smooth, too symmetrical, not built by hand but formed as though grown with purpose. Then the corridor widened, opening into a vast chamber. Jackson stopped first. The squad followed, spreading out. The space around them was massive, a cathedral of alien architecture carved into the world itself. Towering structures stretched toward a ceiling lost in shadow. Strange symbols ran along the floor, etched deep, glowing faintly as if their purpose had long been dormant. Until now. Hale crouched, running a scanner over one of the markings, his brow furrowed. "It's not a language. It's a sequence." Kane stepped further in, his rifle sweeping across the chamber. "Then what's the pattern?" Jackson's gaze locked onto the farthest point of the room. A raised platform, built like an altar, yet lacking anything resembling religious intent. Instead, something rested at its center. Not an object, a vessel, a structure carved from the same impossible alloy as the monolith outside, formed with no visible seams, no wear, no sign of time eroding its shape. It wasn't a relic. It was preserved, waiting. Jackson approached carefully. The pressure in the air deepened, thickened, pressing harder against his skull. He gritted his teeth, stepping closer. Then the whispering stopped. Not gradually, all at once. The walls dimmed. The distant light flickered. The presence pressing against them receded. A realization sank into Jackson's gut. This isn't a chamber. His voice came low, steady. Kane turned. Then what is it? Jackson exhaled slowly. It's a command center. Hale stood, his scanner flashing erratic readings. And we just woke it up. Then, without warning, the vessel shifted. A tremor pulsed outward, not from the structure itself, but from the entire chamber. The walls responded, the air tightened, and the space around them adjusted. Jackson stepped back, rifle raising, because whatever they had uncovered was no longer waiting. It was activating. Jackson's grip tightened around his rifle as the chamber around them began to shift, the deep etchings along the floor pulsing in synchronized patterns. The vessel at the platform's center reacted, lifting from its cradle without visible force, hovering as though gravity itself had surrendered to its presence. Kane took a measured step back, eyes scanning every shifting detail. "Commander, we need a plan before this turns into a tomb." Jackson's mind worked through the possibilities. If this was a command center, it wasn't just activating, it was responding. The real question was whether it saw them as operators or intruders. "Hale, get a data link on that vessel. We need to know if we can interface with it. Jackson ordered, keeping his stance firm. Kane, set up a perimeter. If this thing locks us in, I want controlled routes for fallback. Hale moved fast, adjusting his scanner. Linking in now. His voice stilled. The screen on his forearm glitched, then displayed something new. Not code, not data, but a directive. One word. Accept. Jackson's jaw clenched. This thing thinks we're part of it, Kane muttered. Or it's deciding if we should be. The vessel pulsed again, sending a low, resonant vibration through the air, something felt rather than heard. The lights along the chamber walls aligned with the pulse, forming a calculated sequence. Jackson recognized a pattern when he saw one. Hale, can you decrypt the rhythm? If this is a system response, we can manipulate it. Hale's fingers worked fast, recalibrating his scanner. Not traditional encryption, but there's a delay in each pulse, like a call and response mechanism. If we time it right, we can insert our own input. Jackson nodded. Then we take control before it decides for us. Kane motioned to his squad. Set tactical sync. If this thing turns hostile, we force an exit. Jackson studied the vessel, then the surrounding architecture. Everything in this place operated on a precise system, not random energy. That meant strategy could override force. Hale, find the lowest frequency response. If we match the delay, we can mimic an authentication. Hale's brow furrowed as he adjusted the scanner. There's a weak pulse just before every main sequence. If I can replicate it... His device flickered, then the chamber reacted. The pulses slowed, aligning with Hale's transmission. The vessel descended slightly, its glow stabilizing. Jackson exhaled. They weren't being rejected. Kane's voice remained edged. And if it realizes we're faking it? Jackson's expression hardened. Then we stop pretending and take it by force. The chamber pulsed one final time. Then a passage opened beyond the vessel, revealing something far more dangerous than any weapon. A fleet. Jackson exhaled. This wasn't just a control room, it was a war terminal. And now, it was listening. Jackson's heartbeat settled into a measured rhythm as he took in the silent fleet stretching beyond the chamber's threshold. The vessels, vast and monolithic, loomed in rows, their surfaces void of insignias, their design unlike anything recorded. They weren't docked. They were preserved. Hale ran his scanner along the nearest ship. No power signatures, no distress logs, just a waiting silence. Kane exhaled sharply. They're not wrecks. These ships were put here deliberately. Jackson nodded. And now we know what this place is. A war vault. The monolithic structure above had been the lock. They had just turned the key. Jackson turned to his team. This isn't an abandoned fleet. It's a strategic reserve. If we can activate one, we can determine if they're autonomous or require operators. Hale's fingers moved swiftly over his scanner. Still no response from their systems, but the energy flow in this facility changed the moment we interacted with the control sequence. It's not broken. It's waiting for authorization. Jackson weighed the risk. If they powered even one of these ships, they'd expose their presence to whatever security measures were still intact. We need to be ahead of this. Kane, prepare for contingency engagement. If these ships recognize us as intruders, we won't outrun them. We'll have to cripple their systems first. Hale, focus on finding an interface that mimics an authentication key. Kane motioned to his squad. Set charge points on potential access hatches. If these things turn hot, we disable their propulsion and comms before they mobilize. Jackson moved to the nearest ship, studying its surface. It was designed with no visible seams, no traditional airlocks or docking points. The alloy pulsed beneath his fingers, not cold, not warm. Potential energy contained beneath the surface, untouched for untold ages. Hale adjusted his scanner's frequency, aligning it with the delayed pulses from the chamber's core. Commander, I think I found the signal they're waiting for. Jackson's gaze remained locked on the massive structure before them. And? Hale hesitated. It's not a command to power on. It's a request. Kane narrowed his eyes. For what? Jackson clenched his jaw. He already knew the answer. It's waiting for a leader. Silence settled over the squad. The fleet wasn't just a relic. It had been mothballed for something specific. Someone specific. Kane's voice dropped lower. Then the question is, who the hell was it built for? Jackson inhaled slowly. The system hadn't rejected them. That meant something. We don't leave without answers. If these ships are waiting for a leader... He glanced back toward the vessel they had already activated. Then we find out if it's willing to accept a new one. Jackson stared at the fleet stretching before them. A silent armada entombed in a vault untouched by time. Each vessel loomed with unspoken potential, their forms carved from an era lost to history. They weren't relics. They were waiting. Hale adjusted his scanner, his voice low but sharp. The sequence is responding. Commander, this isn't just an activation request. It's an invitation. Kane's stance remained rigid, his rifle still in hand. Who the hell were they waiting for? Jackson didn't answer, because the moment he'd interfaced with the control sequence, the answer had become obvious. The ships had recognized them, not as intruders, not as scavengers, as successors. The pulsing lights across the chamber shifted, synchronizing with Hale's feed, aligning like soldiers awaiting command. The first vessel on the platform trembled, not from decay, not from struggle, but from reawakening. Jackson exhaled. They built this fleet to be used, and if no one came back for it, then it belongs to the one strong enough to claim it. A deep vibration rippled through the chamber, resonating through the walls, the ground, the air itself. The ship's core flared to life, illuminating the vast interior with a steady glow. The moment had arrived. It was choosing. Hale stepped back, scanning wildly. It's transmitting. Some kind of genetic recognition. It's testing us. Kane's expression remained unreadable. If we fail? Jackson met his gaze. Then we die knowing we stood where no one else dared. The pulse of energy tightened, condensed, concentrated. Then, like a heartbeat returning after a long silence, the first vessel came online. A voice filled the chamber, not spoken, not heard, but felt. Worthy. The weight of that single word settled into their bones. The fleet had not been abandoned. It had been left behind, waiting for those who could command it, those who had survived against all odds, those who refused to kneel to the impossible. Jackson turned, his voice steady. Kane, get the squad in formation. Hale, prep the relay for full activation. We're taking this fleet. Kane smirked. They thought we were just scavengers. Let's show them we're conquerors. Hale's hands moved swiftly, feeding the sequence forward. One by one, the vessels stirred, their long dormant systems roaring to life. No longer waiting, no longer forgotten. Jackson stepped forward, placing his hand against the ship's surface. The connection was instant. Not technology, not control, understanding. This wasn't a fleet meant for those who feared war. It was a fleet meant for those who rose to meet it. Jackson's voice carried through the chamber, through the awakened fleet, through the legacy that had been left for them. Deathworlders don't kneel. We don't surrender. When we rise to the challenge, nothing stands in our way. The fleet responded. It was time to show the galaxy why. The fleet came alive, one ship after another, their dormant cores igniting like embers fanned into an inferno. Jackson felt the pulse of it beneath his fingertips, a force that had waited for something, for someone, to claim it. The chamber's walls trembled, not with instability, but with power long withheld. This was no graveyard. It was a rebirth. Hale's voice cut through the rising energy. Commander, every system is responding. This fleet wasn't left behind. It was preserved. Kane's stance remained unyielding, gaze locked onto the awakening warships. Then it was meant for warriors, and now it has them. Jackson stepped back from the interface, rolling his shoulders. The weight of what they had uncovered settled into his bones, not a burden, but a responsibility. Whoever built this fleet had fought once. Now humanity would carry that war forward. The first warship lifted from its platform, its metallic surface gleaming under the vault's pulsing light. Others followed, rows of forgotten vessels shaking off centuries of stillness, preparing for what came next. Jackson turned to his team, his voice unwavering. Hale, Sync the fleet's primary systems with our command relays. Kane, get our forces into position. We're not taking these ships to a museum. We're taking them to war. Hale's fingers flew across his interface. We've got full navigational access. They move when we say. Kane smirked, eyes alight with the realization of what they now possessed. Then we're about to make history. A transmission flared across the comms, an incoming signal from orbit. Indomitable was standing by, the rest of the fleet waiting for orders. Jackson activated the link. This is Commander Voss. We have secured the vault. He exhaled, gaze sweeping over the warships now rising in formation. Prepare for mobilization. We're bringing them home. A pause on the other end, then a voice, thick with disbelief. You're saying we just inherited an entire lost war fleet? Jackson's response was steady, final. Number we earned it. Outside the vault, the world itself seemed to acknowledge their claim. The monolithic structures pulsed once, a farewell or a warning. It didn't matter now. Hale adjusted his headset, reading the fleet's status. Every system is green. Commander, we have a fully operational war armada at our disposal. Kane exhaled, shaking his head. The galaxy is never going to see this coming. Jackson smiled, a sharp, knowing expression. They never see us coming. The fleet ascended, breaking free from the world that had entombed it, rising toward the stars. The void had never known warriors like them, not ones forged in fire, shaped by worlds that sought to kill them, hardened by survival itself. The galaxy had underestimated humanity for the last time. Deathworlders didn't just survive. They conquered, and now nothing would stand in their way.